first speaker, if you look at her bio, you'll see that she's a government employee who's partially furloughed right now. So technically she has agreed to speak as a private citizen and cannot actually speak on the topic that she was assigned, but Alita has a wealth of knowledge in other areas and has done a lot of work on physical activity, health and well-being across the lifespan, and has talked to me briefly and said there were some issues that were not yet covered in the conference that she would like to address as a private citizen. So I'd like to welcome Alita Meyers to the podium.
Hi. So it's exciting to be here to address this. I came to Virginia 20 years ago for the opportunity to work on a dissertation where I could look at the role of sports in promoting social competence. And so it's neat to kind of be coming full circle back to that. I came to VCU to do my dissertation on a program where high school students taught middle school students life skills, and those high school students were student athletes. And so that was in 1992. Think about that time. Richmond's a lot like Baltimore. The risk factors that we saw in Baltimore is often what's going on in Richmond. And they weren't getting any positive effects with this program, and so it was the time of looking inside the black box of implementation, and so I suggested doing that and a qualitative component. And out of that, one of the things that came out was that the kids in 6th grade in Richmond, Virginia were experiencing so much community-level violence. There was so much going on that for them to think about their goals and that kind of thing just seemed kind of silly. They were the day-to-day life issues that they were addressing. And so I switched my focus to violence prevention in middle schools and worked on a program called Responding in Peaceful and Positive Ways. And the first few, that program was designed on social cognitive problem solving. And does anybody know what the first 2 steps of all social cognitive problem solving models are? It's usually stop and calm down. So almost all social problem solving models are focused on that kind of thing. And back then, we were trying to how do you teach deep breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, a lot of things that schools didn't want you to do in their schools. So it's really exciting today to see that both of those things, this context of violence, lots of adversity, maybe physically active interventions can address that, as well as maybe these physically active interventions can really do a much better job with that front end of the social problem-solving model around the stop and calm down. So I wanted to point that out. So for many of us, I would imagine that we're sort of converted, that we've always thought that you've got to pay attention to early childhood. There's all kinds of things going on. And it's been sort of frustrating lately to have this research come out on adverse childhood experiences, on toxic stress, on trauma, pointing out how important these early childhood experiences are to later health, because we've always known that. But one of the things that I think that could really be taken advantage of, an opportunity right now for folks that are focusing on these physically active interventions, is to think about how might the work that you're doing help to address the impacts of early adversity, the fact that that prolonged activation of the stress response system, how that affects immune function, how that affects brain architecture development, how that affects organ development in ways that affects employment in age 40, heart disease, all those kinds of things. How might physically active interventions address that? And I think it's kind of cool to think about that. And that was when Art said there were a couple of things I was surprised not to hear more about. I was surprised not to hear. Are people familiar with the Adverse Childhood Experiences research, ACEs? Okay, so it's some very important research that CDC has done where they've looked to ask people, I guess it came out about 10 years ago, to retrospectively report on the number of adverse events that had happened in their early childhood. And what they found was that once you got over like 2 of those events, that then it really predicted their health and their employment later on in adulthood. There's been this research on toxic stress, which tends to show that the way kids' executive function and their self-regulation develops is very much affected by those early childhood experiences. So people are paying more attention, and I think that you all could benefit from that. So when you think about early adversity, it's not just child maltreatment would be an important one to think about, but issues of chronic poverty, issues of environmental disasters that occur. Those often affect people who are the poorest the most. And one thing to also keep in mind is that those maltreatment and chronic poverty and those kinds of issues can often affect each other and make one more likely to happen. So there's been a lot of discussion about how parenting interventions may be a really strong buffer from this early adversity to what's going on later on in life. And I'd like to, I think that's really important. But with that idea, I think there's also this issue that there's been a lot of progress with evidence-based prevention programs, social and emotional learning programs, that kind of thing, but we're not having the effect that we were hoping that we would have. Programs, today we've talked a lot about how hard it is to implement programs in new settings. Do program models actually have the ability to support places that are implementing their programs? I also wonder if our interventions are powerful enough given the amount of time they take. There's been a lot of question as if you've got an intervention that's 20 hours long that takes a certain amount of time, are we really getting the kinds of effects that we should be able to? And I think that we might get a lot more powerful interventions if we made our interventions more physically active, if they involved body movements, action, much more. And if, for those of us who are developmental psychologists, if you think about the match between developmental theory and intervention design. So a lot of interventions, like a middle school intervention, might have you learn a problem-solving model, do some role plays, break up into small groups, you all get a situation and you imagine what you might do in that situation, and then somebody represents the group to the whole group, and then that's called, that's what the intervention is. And it's often based on social learning theory, but if you think about what social learning theory talks about, learning from valued experts, modeling and imitation, and then practicing until mastery. So you often might learn a listening skill in one lesson in a prevention program, and then a conflict resolution skill in another one, but you never actually master it. But if you think about dance or performances, where a physically active intervention where you actually work towards mastery, so you would practice it over and over, you'd watch somebody do it, you'd practice it, you'd get feedback, you'd get to sleep on it, the next day you'd practice it again, you actually get that self-reinforcing where you're learning it and mastering it, and then you get to perform. Those types of interventions might be a much better match to our theory. Another one to think about is social emotional information processing. The intervention I just described isn't very interesting. And if you think about these physically active interventions where people might go outdoors and do things or play games and that kind of stuff, there might be much more memory attached to that. So it increases the chance that a person might remember what they learned from that in a new setting. So they call that an affect memory link. And so these more active interventions might make an intervention be more effective. So say you've got an intervention that's or a prevention curriculum that's once a week for a whole year. If you match that with a field trip where you did a lot of physically active stuff and you talked about the translation between those areas, you might get more of an effect. And then last night we were talking about how efforts to promote self-regulation, and we talked a lot today about mindfulness. And what I like us to think about is rough and tumble play. So if you think about with toddlers and or kids, wrestling around and all the things that you learn about stopping and starting and putting yourself in the other person's shoes and stopping before you hurt somebody, what kind of opportunities are there? I got the opportunity to edit a book on physical activity across the lifespan, and one of the chapters was written by a veterinarian who does a lot of research on physical play in animals, and he and a colleague did some research to look at how rough and tumble play address issues around ADHD. Because ADHD, kids may not be paying attention to what's going on around them, and maybe rough and tumble play would help them with that. So I guess what I'm saying is that thinking about our interventions that we do that are prevention, that if we made them more active and brought in some of these things that we've been talking about the past couple days, they may actually activate those causal mechanisms that the theories are saying would change in a better way than our existing interventions do. So I just thought I'd talk about this, but I don't. So So I don't know how many of you have read the recent IOM report on preventing mental and social behavior disorders. And a couple important things that they did was they used to have a spectrum of things that you did with kids from prevention to rehabilitation. And then they decided to add a whole thing of promotion there. And that's kind of like positive youth development, I would think about what's going on here. And within that positive youth development, they talked about the need for all kids to be able to deal with adversity. So not just kids who live in the environments that I was describing, but all kids, because there's very good likelihood that they'll have to deal with adversity. And I was thinking again, that physically active interventions may be the best prepared to help people with those real adversities rather than some of our more didactic educational approaches. So I was just thinking, as we reflect on these past 2 days, how might research on strategies to promote physical health in adolescents and young adulthood help to address the consequences of early adversity? So if we think about all the context that kids are growing up in and then how that affects their life trajectories, how might physical activity and interventions throughout that help that group of kids? And I also think that we should think about how might physically active interventions be a way to make our interventions more powerful. We tried really hard to figure out how to get kids to stop and take a deep breath, and had we borrowed or paid attention to mindful approaches or thought more about physically active approaches, I think we could have done that piece a lot better. And so those were just some things I wanted folks to reflect on. So thanks. Let me do a private citizen.